Good morning, I'm Nicole Luthi, and Judy kind of covered everything, so I'll just move on. I'm really happy to be here today to introduce Melissa Wilson. I consider her a friend and longtime colleague, and it's making this trek through the PhD program has definitely been much more enjoyable and bearable having Melissa to accompany me along the way. She's a doctoral candidate in the College of Education and Human Ecology, School of Teaching and Learning, with an interest in language and literacy. And for the past year, she's been studying nonfiction writing in a first grade classroom. In addition to her graduate studies, Melissa is program manager for the Columbus Area Writing Project and has been a former co-editor for Language Arts Journal, a publication by NCTE. And she's taught numerous courses here at the university as well. Being at the university is a second career for Melissa. She enjoyed quite an accomplished career in the Columbus City Schools, where she worked as an elementary teacher, curriculum developer, professional development provider, literacy coordinator, mentor teacher, master teacher, and so on. So she comes to the doctoral program with an extensive background and experience and expertise, which I rely on heavily, I can say. I think I covered everything. No, most importantly, she's my friend, and I often refer to her as my trailblazer because she's a few months, years ahead of me in the doctoral program, and I rely on her to blaze a trail that we can all follow. So it's my pleasure to present Melissa Wilson.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Thank you all for coming today. And I want to thank the center as well, because about 2 years ago, I wrote a grant for I wrote a proposal for one of their grants. And I was informed by my very own dear advisor, Dr. Bloom, that it was one of the worst grant proposals he had ever read. But it was my first, so. But I guess that the center and the committee that was looking at it, saw some merit to it and saw some possibility in it. And so they granted me the money. And with that money, I was able to spend a year in a classroom with Julie Johnson. I bought my camera and my software program that is allowing me to edit and analyze my data. I was able to provide about $600 worth of nonfiction books for the classroom library as a thank you to the teacher and the students for letting me stay in there. And so it was a wonderful gift. And so I thank you for the confidence, the vote of confidence in giving me the grant, the financial support, and most of all for the impetus to get me moving on the road of being an OSU doctoral candidate and getting out there and doing research and doing the work that we're supposed to be doing. I'm going to be talking about nonfiction writing in this first grade classroom, and I'm only going to be showing about 40 seconds of data. But obviously from a much larger study that I conducted in Julie's room. We're going to see one young elementary student and how he publicly displays his socially constructed understanding of what it means to him to write nonfiction as he works on an illustration for his research report. So I'm going to begin by giving you some background to my research question, and then I'm going to discuss the theoretical framework that I'm using as I do my analysis. We'll look at that little piece of data and do some analysis of it, and then I'm going to end with some very preliminary findings because I've hardly begun to analyze my data at this point. I'm glad you said that, Judy, that I didn't have to be very far along in this. Yeah. So. My study, my interest and my study arises from both reading that I did and from my own personal experience as a first grade teacher. There are a lot of research studies that suggest that using nonfiction with young children is a valuable classroom practice. Reading and writing nonfiction offers opportunities for children to become aware of the scientific register, the register of science. It allows them opportunities to become familiar with vocabulary and the very specific conceptual vocabulary of science and social studies. And it's all done in the context of these lovely picture books that children are very familiar with. We have studies that show that teachers and children kind of take on the register of scientific language as they negotiate the meaning of what they're reading. But despite all of those reasons we should use nonfiction, what the research is showing, and it's research as late as 2010, is that there still isn't very much use being made of nonfiction material in early childhood classrooms. And my own experience resonates with that. As a first grade teacher, I really resisted using nonfiction picture books in my classroom for a variety of reasons. One was I was very uncomfortable with them. I wasn't sure how to use them, and I was much more comfortable and perceived that my students preferred story over nonfiction, and so I tended to stick with storybooks. I found that the vocabulary and the conceptual load of reading nonfiction to young children was really heavy, and it took a lot of work for all of us to figure out what these books were about. And then the syntax and the structures, the story structures of nonfiction texts were also very problematic to use both for reading aloud and in reading groups with young kids who were just beginning to learn how to read. And then I met Julie, and Julie I met through the writing project. She read and wrote nonfiction all year long as part of her writing curriculum, aside from her science and social studies curriculum, as part of her writing curriculum. And I found myself sitting in her classroom, actually for a whole year before I ever undertook this study, watching her and her students. And I began to wonder about this gap that I was reading about and that I had experienced. And so I decided that what I wanted to do was to go sit in that classroom and begin to explore how Julie and her students constructed their understandings of what nonfiction was as a genre and how you compose nonfiction, how you write nonfiction. So my overarching question is this one in italics. But in the specific, what we're looking at today, I'm really looking at the second question. So what are the sources that are available to young nonfiction writers? What sources are they using as they write? And how are the sources that are available to them, how are they taken up and used as they write nonfiction? Now, in Julie's classroom, some of the sources that I know, that I observed while I was in her room, included mentor and research texts, and her mini lessons that she taught at the beginning of the writing time, talk amongst and between the students themselves, conferences that the students had with the teachers, with myself, experiments that they did, field trips that they went on, observations that they were making as part of their study, and then their own experiential and cultural funds of knowledge. So specifically, I'm looking at how one student takes up and plays around with, or adapts, or resists, or contests. I don't know what verb to use yet. But how this student uses these sources available to him as he publicly displays his understanding of the genre of nonfiction and nonfiction writing. So I want to turn to the theoretical frames that I'm using. I'm relying on the work of those who approach literacy as a set of social practices. So as Street maintains, literacy is a social act situated in particular social, cultural, and historical contexts. Moreover, these literacy practices have been developed through language use by people in relationship with each other. Street also talks about the ideological model, which suggests we have a framework for understanding literacy in which the premises inherent in the framework are left unquestioned, and thus there's no attempt made to grapple with alternative realities. So understanding nonfiction and the composing processes used to write nonfiction are literacy practices which derive from historical and ideological constructions of what nonfiction means. And these constructions are at least part of the reality of the classroom in which these students were writing and constructing their understandings. I also rely heavily on social constructionism. Social constructionism suggests that there are no universal truths or realities. Rather, all understandings of what constitutes truth or reality are built through relationships within social and cultural communities. Kenneth Jurgen writes, "What we take to be knowledge of the world grows from relationship and is embedded not within individual minds, but within interpretive or communal traditions." So social constructionism doesn't deny that people have individual minds, but it's interested in the shared experiences that people construct and the understandings they construct as members of social groups and in relationship to each other. So social constructionists maintain that social reality is not separate from us, but social realities and ourselves are intimately interwoven as each shapes and is shaped by the other in everyday interactions. Within the context of this presentation, then, the theoretical framework helps me understand that all meaning is made and all knowledge is constructed by acting in relationship to each other. This is from Jürgen. This is to suggest that we remove meaning from the heads of individuals and locate it within the ways we go on together. In effect, then, meaning is constructed through actions between people, and they occur over time. So there's a history to the actions and the relationships as understanding is constructed. And further, there's a strong emphasis in this theoretical framework on language and other systems of representation. Social constructionists suggest that actions and interactions, or the way that we go on together, are most often accomplished through language. And in regards to language, social constructionism assumes that the semiotic sign systems, including language, are themselves social constructions and therefore arbitrary, and that language and other sign systems gain meaning from the way they're used in relationship. That includes not just humans, but also the natural environment. So by locating the construction of academic knowledge and this understanding about nonfiction within these social and cultural contexts, I emphasize the place of language as a tool that helps the participants publicly construct understanding. This understanding isn't in somebody's mind or in the product that the student creates or in the school curriculum itself, but rather in the relationships that are built between the people and the tools and the symbols. And further, the construction of academic knowledge evolves in a public display of understanding. That is, the task required for the public display generates the production of the academic understanding or knowledge. For methodology, I used videotaping during writing workshop segments of the classroom day, took field notes, usually right after I had videotaped, and then I logged my video footage a couple of days after because that was quite onerous. You had to sit and watch it again in real time and make a video log. This use of video to interpret and represent a classroom life comes from Goldman's work and is termed or referred to as video ethnography, and is a way that we can capture those rich details in the classroom community to tell the story of what's going on. But by the same token, the camera isn't neutral. It's no more neutral than the observer who's holding the camera. And so recognizing that the camera's perspective was as biased as mine was, I just kind of said to hell with it, and I held the camera, and so it sees what I see. Actually, it probably sees a little less because I was usually holding it down here. But as a result, there's a lot of panning, turning, doing a lot of things that the video research panel really doesn't recommend that you do with the video camera. But that was a choice that I made purposefully, recognizing the lack of neutrality of the camera. After I collected and logged all of this data, I surveyed it and I chose a few events for transcription immediately. And these were analyzed using discourse analysis methodology. And I use David Bloom's discussion of discourse, and it's consistent with social constructionism. So I define discourse as the use of symbol systems in culturally patterned ways through which participants structure their experiences and come to create shared meaning. I also use Bloom's framing of the methodology of discourse analysis as not a set of methods per se, but a set of ways of seeing language and literacy events in classrooms. So in the following, we're going to analyze several lines from a much larger transcript to examine the question of how the sources available to first graders are taken up in their nonfiction writing. And in this 40-second snippet of data, I have what I believe to be what Jürgen terms an imaginary moment. He defines this as a moment when the conversational participants join in visions of a reality not yet realized by either. The imaginary moments are also somewhat akin to what Fairclough calls cruces, and I'm reading from Fairclough now, this is his definition. Moments in the discourse where there is evidence that things are going wrong. a misunderstanding which requires participants to repair a communicative problem, for example, through asking for or offering repetitions, or through one participant correcting another. Exceptional disfluencies, hesitations, repetitions in the production of the text, silences, sudden shifts of style. So these few lines from the longer conversation between myself and the student, I think, reflect a combination of both an imaginary moment and a crucis. In this clip, you're going to see Alan, who is a 6-year-old first grader whose family had come to the United States from Mexico a number of years previously. Alan had attended kindergarten in this same school the previous year, where he was placed in the English language learning, or the ESL classroom. And then he remained in that program during his first grade year. The classroom teacher had asked me upon several occasions to sit with Alan and help him with his writing on this research report. So I had been with him, I'd been with him all year on and off, but I had been with him frequently in the last couple of observations working on this research report. And this specific interaction occurs on the 3rd of May of last year, where he's finishing his third piece of nonfiction writing for the year, and it's a research report. His entire research report had a cover or title page, an about the author page, and then 4 pages which were the body of his information. And they read, mosquitoes get eaten by turtles, birds, spiders, bats, and frogs. That was one double page spread. A second double page spread, mosquitoes eat nectar from the flowers. The girl mosquitoes suck blood from humans. The third one, and that's the one that we're looking at today, mosquitoes are not a mammal. They lay up to 300 eggs. And the last page was mosquitoes have 2 wings, 2 big eyes, and 6 legs. So he's working on this one, mosquitoes are not a mammal, they lay up to 30 eggs. So I'm going to show you the video slide first, and then I have the transcript for you, and we'll go through and work through the transcript.
We're going to have some friends flying in? Why are all these mosquitoes flying?
From up there.
Why?
Because you know where like there, like they're going from there, and he's calling for his friends to come back, but because they're getting nectar from the flowers, so he said, "Come here." So all of his friends are coming back.
Back to the pond.
Okay. So you have a copy of the transcript of this little 40-second clip. And at this point, this is the completed illustration for this page, or pretty much the completed illustration. But at the point, just to review what you saw, at the point where we hear him talking, he has drawn a wavy line for the water at the bottom of the page. He's drawn the lily pad with the female mosquito and the eggs, those circles on it are the eggs. And he has this moon and star have actually been erased. It's hard to tell that because they're still there, but there's a sun over here now. And he is drawing these dashed lines up here at the top. That's kind of where we start our on the transcript. So as he draws 2 dashes coming from the, 2 dashes up the top right hand of the page, I say you're going to have some friends flying in to him. Now, I am not willy-nilly introducing the word friends into this research report. At this point, we're at line 101 of the transcript, and Alan has signaled his intent to have the male or the dad mosquito call his friends to come see the eggs on the lily pads at lines 55, 81, and 83. So I'm picking up a word that he's used previously. And Alan responds and he says, yeah, they're coming from there, from there, from there, from there, there. And he accompanies the first 4 from there's by drawing 1 line down. And then he goes there, and he's drawing 2 lines with each of those there's under those first 2 lines. And then he says there are not much people because it's for all the whole world. And he adds 2 more lines of 3 dashes to the right of those original 4 lines of dashes. And I then ask Alan, why are all these mosquitoes flying in? Now this is a pretty teacherly question because I actually already know the answer. He's told me they're coming in to look at the eggs and the dad's calling them over. And I really can't tell you why I asked the question, probably because I'm a retired 30-year teacher, but also because I'm keeping the conversational ball rolling. He and I are sitting there and we're talking. And he seems to interpret my question as not as a why question, but as a where question, which may be because he already knows I know the answer. I mean, we don't know really why he interprets it that way. But he answers the question, he says, from up there, and he's motioning with his hand and his pencil to the ceiling. Now, I didn't really see that as a cruces, as Fairclough would call it, because for the reasons I've already mentioned, and because Alan is an ELL student, and sometimes there's a misinterpretation of words, but he's also a first grader, and first graders, in my experience, have a lot of problems with WH words in questions. So I don't really see that as a cruces, but I find his gesture is interesting because he seems to be locating these mosquitoes in an actual place. They're up in the sky and they're flying in, and they're flying into the top of the page, and the lines are their path of flight. Okay. So after this response, I go back to my original question, why? Why are these mosquitoes flying in? And he answers, because they're like, you know, we're like, they're going from there, and he's calling all his friends to come back because they're getting nectar from the flowers. So he said, come here, so all of his friends are coming back. Now, it may seem that Alan is struggling to answer my why question, as evidenced by these repetitions, hesitations, the shift in style. These really would be symptomatic, or the descriptive of what Fairclough describes as a cruces. But the gestures that he uses to accompany the explanation, I think, provide us with some further evidence to consider. While Alan is repeating the phrases at the beginning of the utterance, he's lifting his paper up like this. Okay, and he's pointing and he's motioning in front of his paper and in back of his paper with his pencil in his hand. And I would argue that he's describing with his gestures the motion of these mosquitoes as they fly in from the previous page, which is actually right here. That's the page where they're drinking nectar from the flowers. So he may literally be referring back to that previous page. And they're entering this new page from the top. They're coming from a past event that he's illustrated on the previous page to the current event. And he signals this with these deictic references that are both gestural, you know, like this, and in his discourse, he says he's calling all his friends to come here. They're coming from there, and he's calling his friends to come back. So we see Alan also referring back to scientific knowledge that he's written in his report as he's telling us how these mosquitoes are moving onto the page. So I use Alan as kind of to represent kind of a collective understanding, even though I really have very limited analysis of my data. It appears that Alan is publicly displaying his understanding of nonfiction writer and of nonfiction as a genre, as it's been constructed in his classroom by taking up and using various sources that he has available to him. First of all, he understands that a nonfiction writer researches from books and uses mentor texts as models from his writing. He's relied on the information that he has researched and produced to write the text of his research report, even to the point of plagiarizing it. Not all of that language was really reworded. Some of it was copied right out of the book. He also uses conventions from a mentor text to help him produce his writing. What you couldn't see because his hand covers it in that illustration, but the teacher had modeled a mentor text that used ellipses. And so his page is mosquitoes ... are not a mammal. All of the young people who used the ellipses as their mentor text didn't just use the ellipses, they read the ellipses. And they read them in this sort of jolly rhythmic fashion. Mosquitoes ... are not a mammal. And all of them, there were more than Alan who used that mentor text model. They all used it, and they all played with the actual ellipses and sang really the ellipses in their text. So he understands that we use these books and we use these mentor texts for research and as models. He understands that, and again, based on what his teacher has worked with him around, because she presented 4 different mentor texts they could use as models for their writing. He understands that nonfiction is a genre that provides information. Now, some of the information he's researched and written explicitly on his page, but other information is implicit, and you only understand it as he talks about his illustration. So we're led to infer that the male mosquito is calling to the other male mosquitoes over, because we understand that he knows that only male mosquitoes drink nectar. That's not explicit, but it's kind of implicit in his talk. And later on, just after that, he begins to fuss about how many mosquitoes he needs to draw, because he understands mosquitoes fly in swarms, and so he's trying to figure out how many would a swarm be. He also understands that nonfiction writers employ a sophisticated array of visual symbols. Again, coming from mini lessons and read-alouds with a teacher who's really worked on the visual aspects of nonfiction writing. So on the page that he's illustrating, he uses these dashes to mark the path of flight of the mosquitoes and eventually a bird. He incorporates a loop-the-loop set of dashed lines, and he tells me as he's doing this loop, these loops, it's happy, that's why he's doing that. And he uses the star shape and the moon shape, and then later he does an inverted, or he does the spread out V to represent a bird. So he's using these very sort of sophisticated visual array of symbols, but it's not really clear where any of those came from, because I really don't think, Julie never talks about using those specific symbols in her mini lessons about the use of symbols and using visual symbols and signs in nonfiction text. So my guess is that Alan is actually relying on funds of knowledge that he has from home, like comic books or video games or cartoons, to use as he makes these illustrations. He also Alan knows that you use a wide variety of sources. So when he's doing his illustration and telling this narrative, this story in the midst of this of his illustrating, he's calling on what he understands from his community and his family and his cultural practices to create this anthropomorphized heteronormative mosquito family that has a mom and a dad and babies in form of the eggs. And that the dad is in charge. He talks about this is the dad mosquito. He's the big man, and he's the one who's calling the friends to come and join him in the viewing of the eggs. So this is probably understandings that he has, that he's jointly constructed within his own family and within his own community, that he brings to this part of his illustration. Alan also displays practices of writing workshop as they have been constructed in his classroom. He understands that the illustration matches the picture, that the illustration fills the page. The illustration doesn't cover the words at the bottom of the page. He feels free to add more words to his illustration, so he does the speech bubble. And then finally, he understands how to be a partner in a classroom conversation with me. He asks me questions, he answers my questions, he keeps the conversational ball going with me. So we see Alan publicly displaying his understanding of nonfiction in some very ideological ways that he's learned from his community and from his classroom and the classroom practices, using things like the loops and the sun shape. But he also seems to contest some of the ideological boundaries of the way that nonfiction has been constructed as a genre in his classroom. Specifically with that, in this snippet, with a story about the mosquito family. And I found in Karen Gallis's work, she works with first graders, and she found that her students do something that she calls using scientific imagination. So she said her students were observing animals, and so they were taking on the role of the scientist, but they were also taking on the role the animal that they were observing. So they kind of moved into that animal. And I think that very possibly that's going to be a helpful insight for me as I look at my data, because it does seem that Alan has taken on the point of view of the mosquito. He's made him a male. He moves from page to page. He has a family. You know, he's kind of become, Alan has kind of become the mosquito. And there's other evidence in the classroom, and just a little bit of data that I've analyzed, that other children do this. When I was sitting and working with other children at their tables, they began to play what I called a food chain game. So poor Alan always got eaten, but you know, the frogs ate the mosquitoes and the butterflies and the dragonflies, and they'd sit at the table and say, oh, well, I can eat you, and I can eat you, and I can, oh, but you eat me. So they took on the embodiment of the animals that they were. So I think that in Julie's classroom, like in Karen Gallus's classroom, the first graders were embodying the object of their study and taking on their perspective. So in conclusion, from this example, we can see how one student took up and used a variety of sources as he produced illustrations for his nonfiction writing. The sources included mentor and research texts, cultural and experiential funds of knowledge, and constructed understandings of being a nonfiction writer based on classroom routines, teacher lessons, conferences. And we also see there were intertextual relationships amongst these sources. We have echoes back to previous writing and previous research and experiential understandings, which all contributed to Alan's public display of what it meant to be a writer of nonfiction in this classroom. So what does it all mean? Well, I don't really know yet, but I have one thing to offer, and that is that given the continued push for nonfiction as a genre in standardized testing, and the emphasis in the new core standards that by fourth grade, 50% of all reading and writing has to be nonfiction, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure put on early grades, teachers of early grades, to begin working with nonfiction earlier. And so I'm thinking that my study might provide some indications on how classrooms can work together to construct jointly understandings about nonfiction as a genre, but also to provide insight into the sources that students use that are both ideological and non-ideological to that genre as they begin to construct these understandings. Thank you very much. Any questions, discussion?
With Alan, and for all the kids using the scientific imagination notion, do you think, or was there any evidence that this idea of I'm going to be the mosquito may come from their experience with fiction, where they're encouraged to put themselves in other shoes and look at other perspectives, and how would you feel if you were, and do you think that they're using nonfiction knowledge to do that with scientific, or are they transferring into this nonfiction genre and writing what they know about fiction writing?
I think that's a great question. I can't really answer the question. It speaks to some of the readings that I've done that look at how do we actually define nonfiction in classrooms, because it's such a murky topic, and Julie, she was examining it herself throughout the year, as, you know, with me being in there, and then she'd go and have lunch with Barb Kiefer, and Barb Kiefer would really make it murky for Julie. But Julie used some texts that you really would not recognize as nonfiction. She used some texts that were not nonfiction, and she did eventually end up talking to her kids about hybrid nonfiction, where you have the Atlantic Ocean is saying, I am the ocean, my brothers and sisters are. Well, that really, that can lead to some of the kinds of scientific imagination, I think, that young children, that some of these kids were using. And so it's a good question. I mean, I don't, and we'll never probably really know the answer because we can't open their heads up and look, but I think it's just nonfiction itself as a genre has some blurriness to it as well. So. Thank you.